One of my viewers asked me if I can make a reaction to this video. It's called Why Germans Don't Buy Houses. So yeah, I thought this would be interesting because I know nothing of German people's mentality when it comes to buying houses. I don't know if it's maybe they don't see it as a good investment, maybe there's better investments in Germany or better things that can get better returns. But this, I think, will be a good video to react to, just to find out not just about this specific topic, but also just to find out more about the German mentality. And yeah, let's check this one out.
I'm a German who has been living in the US for a little over 5 years now, and last year I even bought a house here. Something that I definitely wouldn't have done if I had stayed in Germany.
And tell me if you live in Germany, if you're from Germany, have you bought a house? Do you own a house? If not, why not?
Why, you ask? Here's the answer. Hello, servus, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Feli. I'm originally from Munich, Germany, but I've been living here in Cincinnati, Ohio, on and off since 2016. And as I just mentioned in the intro, I even bought a house here last fall, which makes me the first one out of all of my German friends to do that, and probably even the first one who has even thought about it. Here in the US, however, I have plenty of friends my age who own their own home. I feel like it's quite normal here to buy a house, even at a younger age, and pay off the mortgage instead of paying rent.
Yeah, that's what I've got to say. Like, I'm from UK, and pretty much everybody I know want to buy houses as soon as possible. Even people that are, not just people who are married, people who are young and single, they would much rather just buy a house than pay rent. They feel like paying rent is just like throwing money down the drain. It's throwing money away because you're paying for someone else's mortgage. For me personally, I'm in the middle because I prefer to put my money into like investments rather than property, but yeah, let's find out more about this.
And in a lot of cases, people just sell their houses again after a few years and move somewhere else, or simply upgrade to something nicer. Germany, on the other hand, is known as a nation of renters. I know that this comes as quite a surprise to most people, but more than half of all Germans actually live in a rented place, and only about 45% of Germans live in a place that they or someone else in the household own. Now, the reason why this is so surprising is that Germany is the country with the biggest economy in Europe and one of the biggest ones in the world. So naturally, you would think that a wealthy country like this has plenty of people that own their own real estate. But the truth is, Germany actually ranks among the last places in the developed world when it comes to homeownership.
Yeah, that's quite crazy. The second lowest in those nations, and it's very low if you look at the numbers at the top. That's half of what is in Spain compared to United Kingdom, which is 70%, a lot lower, 30% lower. Very interesting.
Out of all European countries, only Switzerland has a lower rate than us. These numbers are a little bit older. Most of these countries don't release new numbers regularly, but it really hasn't changed all that much. Germany is still in that same rank today, so it's a helpful graphic to visualize the differences. But how does this make sense? How does a wealthy country like Germany have a lower homeownership rate than poorer countries such as Spain, Greece, or Mexico? Let's talk about it.
Good point, yeah.
So of course, it's not like no German in the entire country owns a house. The title of this video is obviously somewhat of an exaggeration. I personally grew up in a residential neighborhood in Munich where most people did own their homes. Granted, the majority of those houses were row houses or duplexes with a rather small yard where only a thin fence is dividing you from your neighbor's patio and yard, but even that is already a pretty big luxury in a large German city like Munich, because we generally don't have as much space as people do here in the US, where it's standard to have a standalone house with a front yard, backyard, and your own garage or driveway. If you want to hear more about how German and American houses are different, you can check out this video, by the way. It's linked up here, but we're going to stick with
that may be an interesting video to watch as well,
today.
actually.
And in Munich, which is one of the most densely populated and expensive cities in Germany, you'd have to pay a fortune to get something like what I just described as standard in the US. Even buying a 2-bedroom apartment in Munich costs more than a 5-bedroom house here in Cincinnati. But that's just a side note, because that's not actually the reason for the low home ownership rate in Germany. And of course, Munich and Cincinnati are two cities that you can't really compare price-wise. It's just a little glimpse into my personal reality when looking at where I'm from and where I live now and what I can afford here. But first, let's look at the facts. As I just said, the majority of all Germans live in a rental property, and that applies especially to younger and older people. According to this survey by the Deutsche Bundesbank from 2017, it's about 85% of the 25 to 34-year-olds who rent their home, 71% of the 35 to 44-year-olds, and 52% of those over 75.
That's actually mind-blowing. That's a huge number for people who 25 to 34 is like, in the UK, as I mentioned, that's when you really start thinking, they talk about the property ladder, which is like getting on the property ladder, buying your first property in order to be able to like work your way up to like a bigger house when you get to the older age and that sort of thing. So 85% of people, especially this age, is when also you would expect people to be starting families, and usually when people are starting families, they like that security of owning their own property, not renting where they can maybe be thrown out at the end of their contract and having to uproot their family and that sort of thing.
So the highest homeowner rates are among the people between 45 and 74. In that age group, the homeowner rate is at 54 to 60%, so more than half of all people in that age group do own their own home, and only 40 to 46% are renters. Over the last 10 years, the homeownership rate in Germany has only slightly increased, by the way. The homeownership rate also varies within Germany and is different from state to state, with the highest rate of about 65% in the Saarland and the lowest rate of 17% in Berlin.
Wow,
what's interesting
really?
is that overall,
So
there are
different?
fewer homeowners in the so-called new states of Germany, Neue Bundesländer, so in former East Germany, than in West German states, which seems to be a remnant from the GDR.
So is that like really a cultural reason as well? Why would that be so different? Is it like people in those certain regions still have a different mentality from each other?
About 90% of all rental units in Germany are located in multi-family homes. That's a very common type of building that you'll see all over the country, in historical districts, in newly built neighborhoods, in the city centers, and in the suburbs. Eastern Germany is even known for a specific type of multi-family building called Plattenbau. Those buildings consist of prefabricated concrete sheets, Platten, and were mainly used to build quick and cheap housing after World War
So
II.
like
but
small
you find
apartments?
these buildings in other parts of Germany as well. Now let's get to the reasons as to why the homeownership rate in Germany is so low. I did mention that real estate prices in Munich are extremely high, so you might think, well, duh, houses are just a lot more expensive in Germany than in other countries, so fewer people can afford buying a house. But actually, even though in some cities, such as Munich, but also Hamburg or Frankfurt, real estate prices are indeed very high, the average house in Germany only costs around 320,000 euros. Or at least that's the only number that I could find for a nationwide average, because the prices are usually listed per city and not for the entire country. And according to this article by the German news outlet Focus, when you compare the average price for 1 square meter of real estate to the average household income in Germany, the rate is actually very similar to other countries. So an average household in Germany could purchase about 4 square meters of real estate with their yearly net income. That's actually the 5th best rate in the European Union. In many other countries, the average household can afford way less than that. Yet they do own more real estate than Germans, and one reason for that is that you don't necessarily have to purchase a home to own it. You can also inherit it. And that's something that just doesn't take place quite as much in Germany. About half of all German homeowners are currently paying off a mortgage, which indicates that they bought the house themselves. While in Romania, the country with the highest homeownership rate in the world, only about 1% of owners pay off a mortgage.
Wow.
Why is that? Well, there simply isn't quite as much to inherit in Germany, which of course has historical reasons. About 20% of all German housing stock was destroyed during World War II, about 2.3 million homes. An additional 2 million were damaged, and including the refugees from the Eastern occupation zone, about 21 million people needed a home. So in the first few years after the war, West Germany needed to come up with a plan to provide a lot of housing, about 5.5 million homes to be exact, as quickly as possible. And they had to do it in in the midst of a broken economy, with the currency being virtually worthless and a population who didn't have a lot of financial means. The best way to solve the situation was to build government-subsidized social housing in the form of apartment units that people could rent for a reasonable price. The first housing program started right after the end of the war, when there wasn't even an official state and government in place yet, but shortly after the Federal Republic of Germany was officially founded in 1949, the government did also pass the first housing law, Wohnungsbaugesetz, with the goal of having as many people as possible benefit from this. The government ended up funding about 3.3 million homes. 2.7 million were built by private investors that were given access to subsidies, low interest rates, and tax breaks. And so Germany managed to cut the housing shortage in half by 1956.
So the government actually did really, really well.
There wasn't really a high demand for private real estate at the time because of the financial situation. Banks were hardly giving out loans, and multifamily homes could house more people. Most of those newly built homes were rentals. The foundation for Germany's preference to rent was laid. Other countries that were affected by the war, such as the United Kingdom, for example, actually had similar strategies after the war. Still, today, the home ownership rate in the UK is significantly higher, with about 65%.
That's what I was going to say. When she was mentioning about the war, I know that we suffered in the UK, suffered similar losses and similar damage to properties and stuff like that. It's interesting. I never really considered that would still be a problem today, or still be a cause of low ownership of homes, because it was like 50, 60, 70 years ago. So yeah, really interesting.
In 2004, it was up even more. So the big question is, why did the Germans stick with renting, even after the economy recovered and the country experienced the so-called Wirtschaftswunder in the 1950s? One of the answers seems to lie in how much money was put into rentals. Since the UK mainly targeted their housing programs at public and non-profit institutions, excluding the private sector, and kept up renting and construction cost caps for public housing developers, most rental property was of significantly lower quality than privately owned homes because landlords had to cut back in maintenance. As a result, rentals in the UK, especially those that were largely publicly funded, acquired somewhat of a stigma. In Germany, on the other hand, rental regulations were reduced much sooner, in the early 1960s, and the policies were more balanced between the private and the public sector, so that rental housing has stayed of relatively high quality in Germany and is oftentimes nicer than privately owned places in countries like Croatia, Slovakia, or Romania. Which goes to show that owning your own home doesn't always necessarily equal a better housing quality. And German renters seem to be very happy. According to a 2007 survey by the OECD, more than 93% of Germans said that they were satisfied with their current housing situation.
Well, if you're a renter in Germany, are you allowed to actually make changes to the property? I think that's one of the big things about owning a property, is you want to make it your own home. You want to make it suit your personality. Obviously, you can do that with furniture, but sometimes you want to make structural changes to the property. You want to do different things, even hanging things on walls. Sometimes maybe landlords don't allow these sort of things. I know that's the case here in Malaysia anyway. Maybe it's different in Germany, but I feel like one of the things about owning your own property is you have a lot more freedom to make changes, but maybe in Germany, landlords just allow those changes also.
One factor that probably contributes to that satisfaction is that there are a lot of regulations in place to protect tenants in Germany. This includes rent caps that limit rent increases to no more than 20% over a 3-year period. In some cities, it's even 15%. In cities with a particularly tight housing market, we also have a so-called rent price brake since 2015, a rent control, Mietpreisbremse, that keeps landlords from raising rents unreasonably above the local rent index, Mietspiegel. And turns out that rents in Germany are actually cheaper than in many other countries. A one-bedroom apartment in Germany costs about 700 euros a month on average. It's obviously going to be more expensive in a city like Munich, while the nationwide average here in the US for a one-bedroom apartment is at 1,100 US dollars. In addition to that,
seems expensive for me for even Germany.
Unlike in the US, where a standard lease ends after 1 year, and terminating a lease in Germany comes with quite a few rules, especially on the landlord's end. hand. Both
Yeah,
parties
that's what I
usually
was
have to
thinking.
give a 3-month notice, unless the lease agreement says otherwise, and if tenants have lived in the place for over 5 years, the landlord even has to notify them 6 or even 9 months before. Also, landlords can't terminate a lease without having a good reason. That can include the tenant being late with their payments, of course, but also when the landlord needs the place to live in it themselves or for family. That's called Eigenbedarf. They do have to show evidence of this need though, and they can't terminate the lease when they want to sell the place. So landlords are often pretty restricted when wanting to end a lease and often have to overcome a lot of obstacles, which means that tenants don't have to worry about just being kicked out at any given time.
I think that's the
and
biggest
that provides a lot of extra
benefit,
security. Now,
especially if you've got a
besides all of the
family.
upsides of renting in Germany, the German government also just doesn't provide as many incentives to buy your own home as other countries do. Even though there is a homeowner program, the KfW Wohneigentumsprogramm, that gives people who want to buy or build their own home access to low interest loans, it doesn't seem to be enough for people to buy more real estate and even out the lag in tax breaks. Because unlike other countries, Germany doesn't allow you to deduct your mortgage interest payments from your taxes, unless you rent the place out instead of living in it yourself, which then again encourages the renters market more. Also, German banks are generally a little more conservative when giving out mortgages and often require a 20% down payment, while in the UK, you usually only need 5 or 10%, and in the US, you can get a mortgage with a down payment as low as 3%, or in some cases even 0.
Yeah, that was the same in the UK, and that was a big reason why they suffered really bad in the financial crisis, is we're just basically giving out mortgages to anybody, no need for deposit. But it's really good to hear that Germany has such a responsible government and a lot of great processes, a lot of good policies in place. Really low risk, and it means it's safer for the economy in the long run.
At the end of the day, this just keeps the threshold of entering the real estate market a little higher than in other countries, and especially excludes people with a lower income. What's also pretty high by international standards are the transaction costs for home purchases in Germany, which makes buying a home and especially frequent moves less attractive. Last but not least, as this article points out, the low homeownership rate in Germany probably also goes back to mentality differences. In most countries, owning your own property is a life goal for many people with a pretty high priority. George W. Bush promised his voters to make the US a homeowner society, for example, and when Brits say things like, "My home is my castle," you can tell that they idealize the idea of owning their own home as well. Meanwhile, according to the article and my personal experience, most Germans are a little more hesitant when it comes to buying real estate and taking out loans, and with the good renter conditions in the country, renting just seems like a very responsible and reasonable thing to do. And that actually lines up perfectly with my personal experience. I kind of mentioned this at the beginning of the video, but I feel like buying a house in Germany is just considered a much bigger step than it is here in the US. It's more like this intimidating adult thing that younger people honestly don't really talk about a lot, even in your 20s, because it's not really a realistic option for most of us. It's something that's way down the road or might never be reality for us. Now, of course, I grew up in a big, expensive city. This is definitely a little bit different in rural areas. But I think it's safe to say that buying a house is just a big decision and a big step for Germans, and I experienced the different reactions when I bought my house last year. While most of my American friends were simply excited for me, many of my German friends looked at it as this huge milestone and couldn't even believe that I was able to do this and how easy the process was here. Americans really make this whole house purchasing process seem like the most casual everyday activity. My realtor even told me that she never had a client that asked as many questions as I did, even though from a German perspective, I really just did what everyone who's about to make a big decision like this should do. But she said that most of her clients usually just want her to handle everything and don't really care to understand all of the details themselves. And the signing of the final purchasing contract took me like 15 minutes. In Germany, I know from my parents that usually takes over an hour because they'll read the entire contract to you. Here, they just summarized the contract for me and had me sign the different pages. I also feel like even for Germans who could technically afford it, Buying a house isn't even on the table usually until they're sure that they want to stay at that place for a long time, and until then, they rent. You wouldn't really buy a house in Germany when you already know that you're going to move again in a few years. Buying a house is something much more permanent to us. In general, Germans only move 4 to 5 times in their lives, while Americans move more than 11 times on average.
I think I've already moved
With the yearly leases
that
here in
amount
the
of
US,
countries,
especially
never
younger
mind
people often
houses.
choose to move every year instead of extending their lease, and even for families, it's normal to move every now and then. And as I said earlier, just sell your house and buy a new one. So to answer the question of the video, the reasons as to why Germany has a lower home ownership rate than most other developed countries in the world are a combination of the country's history and rebuilding process after World War II, the high quality of rental housing, relatively low rents, the high renters protection, low incentives for homeowners, and probably a little bit of our mentality.
And so I thought actually that it was going to be a big part down to mentality, but actually watching that video, it was just a really small part of the reason was actually the German people's mentality. Can still see that there, that they are a bit more risk averse compared to maybe people in other countries. But a big part of that was actually the government, and I think hearing her explanation, it actually makes a lot of sense, especially if Germany has very good rental properties. Having those policies in place, like things like having to give notice to leave a property and having like longer rental average times and stuff like that, is better, because I think that mostly affects, I think for young people, you can kind of move a house here and there, rent places here and there, but when you've got a family, it's like a big thing. You have to have that sort of stability in staying in a property, and not having to think maybe after 1 year I'm going to have to move and then move again and then move again, and uprooting your family, especially if maybe your children are in education and things. So really enjoyed that. It was really great to find out about this interesting part of German culture. If you're from Germany, tell me what you think. As I said, tell me if you own a property. If not, why not? Thanks.